For days before the murders, Andreas Gruber heard footsteps in his attic. Footsteps that shouldn't have been there. He found strange tracks in the snow leading from the forest to his farmhouse, but none leading away. The family maid had quit just weeks before, too frightened to stay another night. She told neighbors the house was haunted. On March 31st, 1922, Andreas told a neighbor he had found a newspaper in his home that no one in the family had bought. Someone had been living in their house. Someone had been watching them, and that someone was still there. Intent. It's what separates accident from murder, passion from premeditation, justice from revenge. It is not the act itself, but the intent behind it that makes it a crime. Today on Deadly Intent, we're traveling to a remote Bavarian farmstead where 6 people were brutally killed with a pickaxe. But the killer stayed in the house for days afterward, feeding the livestock, eating meals, and even braiding the hair of one of the victims. After more than a century, the question remains: what kind of person could live among the dead? And why did they want the Gruber family to suffer? I'm Carman Carrion, and if you know me from Freaky Folklore or Destination Terror, you know I've spent years exploring the dark corners of human imagination, the legends we tell, the places we fear, the creatures that haunt our nightmares. But I've come to realize that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones from our folklore. They're the ones who walk among us, who breathe the same air, who look just like you and me. Welcome to Deadly Intent, where we dive deep into the criminal cases that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. Not just the what or the how, but the why. Because understanding intent, that driving force behind the most heinous acts, that's where the real horror lies, and the real answers too. Today we're beginning with one of the most baffling and disturbing cases in criminal history. It happened over a century ago in rural Bavaria, but it still sends chills down the spines of investigators and armchair detectives worldwide. 6 people dead, a killer who vanished without a trace, and evidence so strange it reads like something from the very folklore I usually cover. Except this nightmare was real. The Hinterkaifeck murders weren't just brutal, they were personal, calculated. And whoever committed them didn't just kill and run, they stayed. They made themselves at home among the corpses. The question that's haunted people for over 100 years isn't just who did this, but what kind of mind could conceive of such cruelty, and why this particular family had to die. So settle in, because we're about to explore a case where the intent behind the entire crime is just as mysterious as the killer's identity. March 1922. The Hinterkaifeck farm, located between the Bavarian towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, was home to Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old farmer known for his hard work and short temper. He lived with his wife Kazilia, 72, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, 35, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Kazilia, named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Josef. The farm was modest but self-sufficient. Chickens pecked in the yard, cows grazed in nearby fields, and the family grew enough crops to sustain themselves through Bavaria's harsh winters. It was the kind of place where neighbors might not see each other for weeks at a time, where self-reliance wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. But in the weeks leading up to March 31st, 1922, something had begun to disturb the peaceful rhythm of life at Hinterkaifeck. It started with footprints. Andreas first noticed them in early March, tracks in the snow leading from the forest directly to his farmhouse. What made them particularly unsettling wasn't just their presence, but their pattern. The footprints approached the house, circled it, even came right up to the windows and doors. But Andreas could never find where they led away. As someone whose husband travels frequently for work, the idea of finding unexplained footprints outside my property while I'm home alone with the kids sends chills down my spine. The violation of safety that Andreas must have felt. Night after night, Andreas would check the snow around his property, and night after night, he would find fresh tracks. Someone was coming to his farm regularly, studying his home, watching his family. The tracks were always the same size, always made by the same boots, suggesting this wasn't random vandalism. This was systematic surveillance. Then came the sounds from the attic. The Gruber family began hearing footsteps above their heads at night. Slow, deliberate steps moving back and forth across the attic floor. When Andreas investigated, he found nothing. No signs of entry, no disturbance among stored items, no explanation. But the footsteps continued, night after night, as if someone were pacing above them while they slept. The final warning came in the form of a newspaper, a Munich publication that none of his family had purchased. Someone had brought it to the farm, left it where they would find it, as if marking territory. Most disturbing of all, several keys had gone missing from the farmhouse. Important keys that could unlock doors, outbuildings, even the main house itself. I've lost my house keys before and it's inconvenient, but having them stolen, especially when my husband's away and it's just me and the kids, that's the kind of thing that would keep me awake at night, checking locks obsessively. Andreas wasn't given to hysteria, but these incidents clearly troubled him. He mentioned them to neighbors, even discussed the possibility that someone might be living secretly on his property. One neighbor later recalled Andreas saying he suspected someone had been hiding in his attic, coming down at night to take food and supplies. But in rural Bavaria in 1922, what could be done? There was no telephone to call for help, no police station within miles. You dealt with problems yourself, or learned to live with uncertainty. Andreas Gruber chose to live with it. That decision would cost him everything. Let's pause here and consider what we've learned about intent. This wasn't random. Someone had been systematically studying the Gruber family for weeks, possibly months. They knew the family's routines, their vulnerabilities, the layout of their property. They had stolen keys, meaning they could enter the house at will. But why? Most criminals who case a location are planning a robbery. They study the property to determine when it's empty, what's worth stealing, how to get in and out quickly. Their intent is simple: take what they want and disappear. But the evidence at Hinterkaifeck suggests something far more disturbing. The systematic surveillance, the stolen keys, the apparent occupation of the attic. These aren't the actions of someone planning to rob the family. These are the actions of someone planning to replace them. Forensic psychologists today have a term for this behavior: residential necrophilia. Not sexual necrophilia, but a psychological compulsion to possess not just someone's belongings, but their entire existence, their home, their routine, their life itself. What if the killer's intent wasn't just to murder the Gruber family, but to slip seamlessly into their place, to eliminate them and then live as they had lived, sleep in their beds, eat their food, tend their animals? What if the weeks of surveillance weren't just preparation for murder, but preparation for becoming someone else entirely? March 30th, 1922. The day before the murders, their previous maid finally quit her position. She had been complaining for months about strange sounds, unexplained footsteps, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. She told people in the village that she believed the farmhouse was haunted. March 31st, 1922, dawned clear and cold at Hinterkaifeck. For the Gruber family, it should have been a day of new beginnings. After losing their domestic help, they had quickly been able to hire a replacement. Maria Baumgartner was 44 years old, a widow who needed work and had agreed to take the position despite unsettling circumstances. The previous maid had quit abruptly, claiming the farmhouse was haunted. She told people in the nearby village about strange sounds, unexplained footsteps, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Most people had dismissed her claims as superstition, common attitudes in the area at that time, but Maria was desperate for employment and couldn't afford to be choosy. She arrived at Hinterkaifeck on the morning of March 31st, carrying her new belongings and ready to begin her new life with the Gruber family. She would be dead before midnight. We don't know exactly how the day unfolded, but we can piece together details from crime scene evidence. The farm animals were fed and watered. Evening chores were completed. The family ate dinner together, possibly with Maria joining them for her first meal as part of the household. As darkness fell over the Bavarian countryside, someone approached Hinterkaifeck with deadly intent. But here's what makes this case so disturbing. The killer didn't approach as a stranger. The stolen keys, the weeks of surveillance, the apparent familiarity with the property, all of this suggests that when death came to Hinterkaifeck, it came from someone who already knew the farm intimately, someone who may have already been living there in secret. The killer struck sometime after nightfall on March 31st. Based on the position of the bodies and forensic evidence available to 1920s investigators, here's what likely happened. Andreas and his wife Kazilia were lured to the barn, most likely one at a time, probably under the pretense that something was wrong with the animals. It was the kind of excuse that would naturally draw a farmer away from his house after dark, urgent enough to investigate immediately, but not alarming enough to bring the whole family. Once in the barn, they were attacked with a mattock, a heavy farming tool similar to a pickaxe. It was the perfect weapon for someone who wanted to kill efficiently, using items already available on the farm. The forensic evidence suggests that Andreas was struck first, but the blow wasn't immediately fatal. Analysis of blood patterns and body position indicated that he had been wounded, then tried to crawl away from his attacker. He may have lived for several minutes, conscious and aware, before succumbing to his injuries. Kazilia suffered multiple blows to the head and died quickly, but the killer's work was far from finished. Victoria and her 7-year-old daughter, little Kazilia, were also lured to the barn, where they met the same fate as Andreas and his wife. I have to pause here for a moment. As a mother myself, the murder of 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph is almost unbearable to discuss, but their story deserves to be told. The child's body showed defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she had tried to protect herself. Most horrifically, forensic evidence suggests that little Kazilia survived for several hours after the attack, slowly dying while trapped beneath the bodies of her family members. She had torn out clumps of her own hair in her final moments. 2-year-old Joseph was discovered dead in his crib. The killer had gone upstairs to the nursery and murdered a sleeping toddler, ensuring that no member of the Gruber family survived. Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had worked at Hinterkaifeck for exactly 1 day, was found dead in her small bedroom. She had likely heard the commotion, perhaps tried to hide or escape, but the killer had hunted her down as well. 6 people in total, an entire family, plus their domestic employee, all dead from blows to the head with the same farming implement. But here's where the Hinterkaifeck case transitions from horrific multiple murder to something that defies rational explanation. The killer didn't leave. For 4 days after the murders, someone continued to live at Hinterkaifeck. The farm animals were fed and watered daily. Someone had to tend to them. Cows need milking. Chickens need grain. Horses require care. These tasks were performed meticulously, as if nothing had happened. Meals were prepared and consumed in the kitchen. Investigators would later find evidence that food had been cooked, dishes used and washed, bread baked in the oven. Beds were slept in. Someone had made themselves comfortable in the farmhouse, sleeping peacefully while 6 corpses decomposed throughout the building. I have been watching and listening to true crime cases for years, but the idea of someone cooking breakfast while surrounded by corpses, that's something I genuinely struggle to comprehend. Neighbors would later report seeing smoke rising from the Hinterkaifeck chimney on multiple days following March 31st. Smoke that could only mean someone was inside, keeping fires burning for warmth and cooking, maintaining normal rhythms of domestic life. One neighbor, George Siegel, later told investigators he had seen a man walking through the farmyard on April 1st, the day after the murders. The figure was too distant to identify, but he was moving casually around the property, as if he belonged there. Think about this scenario for a moment. 6 people have been brutally murdered. Their bodies are decomposing throughout the property. The smell alone should have been overwhelming. Yet someone was calmly going about daily household routines, cooking breakfast, feeding animals, sleeping peacefully. This wasn't a killer hiding from justice or laying low until it was safe to flee. This was someone who had achieved exactly what they wanted: complete possession of the Gruber family's life. The bodies weren't discovered until April 4th, when neighbors finally became concerned that no one from the farm had been seen for several days. George Siegel and another neighbor went to check on the family. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Andreas and Kazilia were discovered in the barn, their bodies covered with hay and an old door as if someone had made a crude attempt to conceal them. The smell of death was overwhelming, but it was clear that someone had been moving around the barn regularly. The hay covering was fresh, and the animals showed no signs of recent care. In the house they discovered Victoria and little Kazilia had also been dragged from the barn and placed inside. Josef and Maria were found where they had been killed, in their bedrooms. The scene was nightmarish, but what made it even more disturbing were the signs that someone had been living there. Used dishes, recently cooked food, beds that had clearly been slept in after the murders. The killer had finally left, but when? And more importantly, why leave it all after going to such lengths to possess the family's life? Let's examine the killer's intent more deeply. This wasn't a robbery. Nothing of significant value was taken from the property. Despite the killer having 4 full days to search thoroughly, this wasn't a crime of passion or sudden rage. The extended surveillance period, the stolen keys, the systematic approach to the murders, all of this proves extensive premeditation. This wasn't even a typical family annihilation, where the killer destroys those closest to them before taking their own life or fleeing in panic. No, this was something much rarer and more psychologically complex. The killer's intent appears to have been total possession, not just of the family's belongings, but of their entire existence. They wanted to live in the Gruber house, eat the Gruber food, sleep in the Gruber beds, tend the Gruber animals. But they couldn't do that while the Gruber family was alive. Modern forensic psychology recognizes this type of behavior as identity theft, taken to its ultimate extreme. The killer may have been someone who felt their own life was inadequate, who became obsessed with the idea of literally becoming someone else. The weeks of surveillance weren't just preparation for murder. They were preparation for assuming a new identity. The killer was learning how to be Andreas Gruber, how to run his farm, how to live his life. When my husband's traveling and I'm alone with the kids at night, I understand that self-reliance Andreas felt. But sometimes I wonder if that pride, that reluctance to ask for help, cost him everything. This explains the methodical nature of the murders. Each family member had to be eliminated because each one was a potential witness to the killer's deception. Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, the children, even the maid who had just arrived, all had to die so the killer could take their place without detection. But it also raises a chilling question. If the killer's intent was to permanently assume the Gruber family's identity, why did they eventually leave? One possibility is that the reality of living with decomposing corpses made the fantasy impossible to sustain. Another is that the killer realized neighbors would eventually come looking, making discovery inevitable. But there's a third, more disturbing possibility. That the 4 days at Hinterkaifeck were just a trial run. That the killer left because they had learned what they needed to know about living someone else's life, and they were ready to find a more permanent opportunity. Somewhere else, with another family, in another isolated farmhouse. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders began immediately after the bodies were discovered on April 4, 1922. Local police, overwhelmed by the scope and brutality of the crime, quickly called in investigators from Munich. By the standards of 1920s forensic science, the investigation was thorough. But by today's standards, it was woefully inadequate. There was no systematic crime scene photography. Physical evidence was collected haphazardly. The bodies were examined briefly by a local doctor, then buried quickly due to advanced decomposition and public health concerns. Reading through these old police reports, I can feel the investigators' frustrations. They knew they were dealing with something unprecedented, but they just didn't have the tools we have today. The mattock used in the killings was found on the property, but it yielded no useful information. Fingerprinting was still relatively new technology, not widely available to rural police departments. DNA analysis wouldn't be invented for another 60 years. What the investigators did have was witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and an abundance of theories about who might have committed such a horrific crime. Over the following months, more than 100 people were questioned. Suspects ranged from family members to local laborers to traveling criminals who might have targeted this isolated farm. The most persistent theory involved Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel. Carl had been declared dead during World War I, but his body was never found. Some investigators theorized that he had actually survived, returned home to find his wife living with another man. Josef's father was unknown and widely believed to be someone other than Carl, and had killed the family in a rage. This theory gained traction because it explained the killer's intimate knowledge of the property and the family's routines. But there were problems with this theory. Neighbors described the footprints in the snow as being made by someone smaller than Carl Gabriel had been. The systematic surveillance didn't match the profile of an enraged husband seeking immediate revenge. And most importantly, no evidence ever surfaced that Carl had survived the war. Other suspects included Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had been having an affair with Victoria and was likely Josef's father. He had access to the property and intimate knowledge of the family's routines, but he also had a solid alibi for the night of the murders. Local men who had worked on the farm in the past and might have harbored grudges against Andreas Gruber, who was known for his difficult personality and harsh treatment of employees, were also investigated. Traveling laborers or criminals who might have been watching the farm and planning a robbery were considered as well. But every lead ended in frustration. Every suspect either had an alibi, lacked sufficient motive, or didn't match the evidence from the crime scene. As months turned into years, the case grew cold. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was demolished in 1923, and the land was sold to new owners who wanted no connection to the murders. The case officially remained open, but active investigation ceased. The killer had vanished, as completely as the footprints that had once led to the Gruber farmhouse. I actually didn't know that the German police had reopened this case in 2007 until I started researching Hinterkaifeck just a few months ago. When I read about it, I'll admit I got excited. Finally, I thought we might get answers. That disappointment when the DNA came back inconclusive. I felt that. In 2007, 85 years after the murders, German police made an extraordinary decision. They reopened the Hinterkaifeck case. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, had solved numerous cold cases from the early 20th century. Investigators hoped that evidence preserved from the original crime scene might finally yield the breakthrough that had eluded their predecessors. A team of modern forensic experts, led by the Bavarian state police, began reviewing every piece of physical evidence that had survived from 1922. Hair samples, fabric fibers, even fragments of the murder weapon were subjected to state-of-the-art analysis. The results were disappointing. While the new investigation confirmed many details about the murders and provided a clearer picture of how the crimes were committed, it failed to identify the killer. Too much time had passed. Too much evidence had been lost or contaminated. The case was once again closed, this time with the grim acknowledgement that it would likely never be solved. But the 2007 investigation did contribute something valuable. It confirmed that the killer's behavior was even more aberrant than originally believed. Modern forensic experts were able to establish a more precise timeline of the murders and the killer's subsequent activities. They confirmed that someone had indeed been living at the farm for several days after the killings, and they found evidence suggesting the killer had been systematically going through the family's personal belongings, not searching for valuables, but examining intimate details of their lives. Photographs had been looked through, personal letters had been read, clothing had been tried on. This wasn't just a killer hiding from justice. This was someone actively studying how to become the people they had murdered. As we near the end of our investigation into Hinterkaifeck, let's return one final time to the question of intent. We've established that this wasn't random violence, wasn't robbery, wasn't even conventional family annihilation. This was something far more complex and disturbing, a systematic attempt to steal not just lives, but an entire identity. The killer's intent appears to have evolved in stages. First came obsession. Someone became fixated on the Gruber family, possibly envying their seemingly peaceful country life, their self-sufficiency, their isolation from the complexities of post-war German society. Second came surveillance, weeks or months of studying the family, learning their routines, possibly even living secretly in their attic while observing their daily lives. Third came preparation, stealing keys, ensuring access to the property, planning the systematic elimination of every family member and potential witness. Fourth came execution, the murders themselves, carried out with methodical efficiency, using a tool from the farm itself. And finally came the most disturbing phase, possession. 4 days of living as the Gruber family, tending their animals, eating their food, sleeping in their beds, surrounded by their corpses. But here's what haunts me the most about this case. The killer eventually left. After going to such elaborate lengths to possess the Gruber family's life, after committing 6 murders to achieve that goal, they simply walked away. The question is why? Did reality fail to match the fantasy? Was living among decomposing bodies too horrific even for someone capable of multiple murder? Or had they learned everything they needed to know about assuming someone else's identity? This case has haunted me since I first started researching it a few months ago. When I'm home alone with the kids, I found myself checking our locks twice and wondering, could something like this happen again? There's one possibility that's almost too frightening to consider. What if the 4 days at Hinterkaifeck were just practice? What if the killer left because they had mastered the art of becoming someone else, and they were ready to find a more permanent situation? Another isolated family, another opportunity to study and plan and strike. We know that whoever killed the Gruber family was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice. They vanished into the German countryside in 1922 and were never seen again. But never seen again doesn't necessarily mean they stopped killing. It might just mean they got better at it. Somewhere in Bavaria, in the spring of 1922, a killer walked away from 6 murders, carrying with them the knowledge of how to steal someone's entire existence, and we have no idea what they did with that knowledge. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was demolished in 1923, barely a year after the murders. The new owners wanted no connection to the horror that had occurred there, no reminder of the family who had died so brutally. Today, nothing remains to mark the spot where the Gruber family lived and died. Fields of grain wave in the Bavarian wind where their farmhouse once stood. The forest that sheltered their killer's approach has grown thicker and darker with age, but the questions remain as vivid as ever. What drives someone to want not just to kill, but to become their victims? What kind of mind conceives of murder, not as an end in itself, but as a means to assume someone else's identity? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how many other isolated families might have fallen victim to someone who learned, in those 4 terrible days at Hinterkaifeck, how to steal a life completely? Was this murder driven by hatred or longing? Was it a desire to destroy or to belong? The killer who walked away from Hinterkaifeck in April 1922 took those answers with them into history, leaving behind only footprints that led to the house but never led away. That's the question behind every case we examine here on Deadly Intent, because understanding why someone kills isn't just about solving crimes. It's about understanding the darkest corners of human nature. Thank you for listening to Deadly Intent. If this case fascinated you as much as it disturbed you, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time as we explore another case where the intent behind the crime is just as mysterious as the crime itself. Until then, remember, every killer has a reason. But does reason ever justify murder?